Yeah, so let's get this starting. I'm going to talk about designing adaptive components that go beyond responsive breakpoints. So I'm Stephanie Walter. I'm a UX researcher and product designer in Luxembourg. So hello to my German neighbors. I've been working for more than 10 years for a web agency, a university, for banks, insurances, and a lot of different clients. I'm currently working for a European investment bank. Why is it blipping when I change the thing? Okay, so when talking about components and when you kind of imagine the topic about how might our component adapt, the first thing you usually think about is, okay, we need our components to adapt at some point to browser condition like smartphone devices or like just having the browser full screen or maybe a little bit smaller, things like that. The issue we have is ordinary design tools, they're still kind of forces to design these static pictures of what the component will look like in one single state size. And it's becoming a little bit better, like Figma has some of those, I never remember the name, but the component can stretch and such. So it's a little bit more flexible, but at some point you're still kind of exporting these static images at different sizes. So usually when trying to design a component that adapt, I start with the content. I try to go the highest level possible and the most abstract level possible. So I start with a content model. The content model is about understanding what type of content I will have. So this is kind of a mixed method inspired by two people. So OOUX, user-oriented, I don't remember, or object-oriented UX by Sophia V. Prater, and content modeling by Rachel Lovinger. So I want to understand, like, for my content, so let's say we're going to build a cooking recipe website. I want to understand for each piece of content, what do I have, but also what are the attributes and metadata. If you think about cooking recipe, I might have recipe. At some point, I need someone to actually write those recipes. So I might have authors, or even if it's my blog, I'm still an author, and I might have ingredients. So I try to understand like the different type of content recipe offer ingredient. How do they relate to each other? Like an author can write different recipe, a recipe belongs to an author. A recipe also has some related recipes. So you have this kind of loop. And I try to understand also what can people do with those, like the kind of actions that we can have. And I built this kind of little content model. So usually this helps me as a designer understand the different part I'm going to need to have in my component, but also it usually helps the developer also understand that at some point you need to fetch that content. If I say the recipe has a picture, we need to fetch that picture. So more about that later, but what happens if I actually don't have a picture for this specific components. So this is really like going to the highest or like lowest level possible, depending on how you see that, about what are the ingredients, pun intended, of my components. Then I like to set content priority to build pages and variations of the component. So I'm sorry, I'm going to use a travel metaphor. I was hoping I could by end of 2021, but still it's a little bit touchy, but I try to see my content as kind of 3 different ways to pack it if I go on a trip. So if you go on a plane trip, you have hand luggage. Hand luggage is like top priority content. It's the top priority things you're going to need while you travel. You usually put in your hand luggage everything you need all the time. Your smartphone, your passport, some water, something like that. Then you have cabin luggage. It's going to be the kind of content that you need eventually, especially on long flights, but you don't need it right away. So this is secondary content. And then there's low priority content, which is kind of the luggage you check directly in the hold. You need the content and you need those things that are into this luggage once you arrive at destination, most of the time. So it's going to be this kind of supporting content or the content that you need later, and usually the content that you also have on those kind of full pages. So how do you decide about the priority? Well, do your homework, user research. So usually when you start fighting about whether content should be a super high priority, low priority, and all of that, this is the kind of content you want to focus your user research on. So coming back to my cooking recipe site, now I have like split those content in 3 different categories: top, medium, and lower priority. So the whole content model is actually going to help me build a full page. And on a full page, you will usually try to include at the top of the page the most important content, in the sense of this is the content you want there so that the user can decide if they want to keep on reading that page or go back to Google to find another recipe for pizza or something like that. So then you can actually have different smaller version of this content, like snippets or overview. If you think about a cooking recipe website, you might have some pages with categories with teasers for those recipes. You might have search results, things like that. So this is usually where I'm going to get like this top priority content, because I want the user, when they see that content, to be able to decide, do I click on it and then I'm going to go to the full recipe, or do I click on another piece? So with this content priority, I'm basically able to have something modular enough to build like not only components at different sizes, but also full pages and prioritize that. So this is what it looks like usually once you have the actual design. So I have 2 variations of my component based on this priority, the kind of bigger version and the smaller one. So when thinking about reusing components, you might say, okay, we can use that for responsive web design, right? We can say on small screen sizes, on small viewport, we have the smaller version. And then whenever things get bigger, something like that, we have a sidebar and we have our cooking recipe with the kind of bigger version. And when you might say, okay, job done. But then the developer comes and says, well, I've implemented your design, but what about these in-betweens? Because on some of viewports, like tablets, and maybe if you have like a split screen or something, this doesn't look great. Like it stretches. So this is okay-ish because it's a pizza, but imagine that this is not a cooking recipe website. This is a blog or a newspaper website. You don't want to have this automated cropping doing something weird, like cutting people's head off and stuff like that. So you might think, you know what, actually, if I want this component to be really flexible, I might need a third version. So I know people talked about t-shirt sizing yesterday, which is kind of the idea here, small, medium, large. I also liked I don't remember who talked about having animal sizes. I really, really like this idea, so I might implement that at some point. But at the moment, let's stick with t-shirt sizes. So now we have 3 versions of that component. The small one is still used for super small screens. Then we have like the bigger, the wider the viewport, the bigger the component. And at some point, we're going to switch from small to medium, medium to large. And maybe the large one, we might not even have it directly on the kind of desktop-ish layout, but still on one of those in-between layouts. So the idea is to have those breakpoints based on how is the component supposed to work in a browser. And when I'm saying breakpoint, I mean like those flexible media query breakpoints. Then the last question I will ask myself is, okay, could we actually reuse this component somewhere else? And this is where I have this kind of nested object. So inside a recipe, I told you before, you usually have related recipes. In case the person didn't like that one, they can find something else. So when I'm saying the next question is actually this kind of a more of a circular process where I'm doing a lot of back and forth and thinking at the same time about how is it going to behave on different screen sizes, on different layouts, but also on different components. But since we live in a world where time is linear, I'm going to go through kind of a linear process here. So we could reuse that as related recipe, maybe in a slider at the bottom of our detail page. Maybe we have a blog that is not about the recipe itself, about something else, but we still want to have this kind of snippets of the cooking recipe somewhere in the blog, because cross-linking is good for SEO. Maybe we want to have those super trendy, fancy kind of card layout, Pinterest-like, those kind of theme season, like the best recipe for winter, something like that. So again, so here you see, not only am I using the same component for different screen sizes, but I'm actually adapting this component to different containers. And that's the idea about kind of having those adaptive components. So technically, we have a lot of things we can do, and we can do in the future to have that. I linked this in the mirror board, but Jen Simmons has an amazing talk about different things that a browser can do. And she talks about this concept of intrinsic web design. And she's basically, instead of changing the layout based on a screen size or a viewport, components should automatically lay themselves out based on those ideal conditions, which means as a designer, I'm going to design those ideal conditions, and then it's kind of going to be a little bit up to the browser to lay out this properly. So we have a lot of things we can do today with that. We have Flexbox, grid layout, clamp, and a lot of other really, really cool tools. So technically, you could build responsive layouts and responsive component without any media query. You can Google that. There's a lot of tutorials on that. Go back to my cooking recipe website. You might wonder, okay, do you need actually media query to have this component adapt? And Geoffrey Croft had some fun with the component. He wrote an article about how you can achieve that. And it's a nice and elegant mix between some flexbox, a little bit of clamp, and you see the component on the left. So this is the same component. Actually, there's not a single media query that is involved here. The component on the left is on a bigger container. The component on the right is inside a smaller container. And it's basically able to lay itself out just based on the layout, the container. At some point, we have a single column, so the container has the same size. But that's the idea. So for my cooking recipe, we can do a lot of things actually just with Flexbox, grid layout, and things like that. We can basically change a lot of the layout. What we can't do, unfortunately, and we still need media queries for that, is having some metadata that we are going to hide or display depending on different resolution or screen size. Also, if you want to change the save button from the bottom to the being on top of the image, this is also something you can achieve directly. So you still need media queries for that. Or you need something called container queries. And this is where things become quite interesting. So for now, we had media queries. Media queries is basically checking for many different things. There's a lot of media query. And the one I'm talking to you about here is checking for a viewport size. It can be a width, it can be a height, and kind of changing the layout based on that viewport size. Container query is going to be next level CSS. Container query is about checking for the component parent. And based on the parent size, it can be width, it can be height again, you will be able to have this a layout change. So container query is basically media queries on steroids. And it's coming to the browser, so yeah. Soon, there's awesome people working on this specification. So it means that soon we will be able to not only adapt the layout based on screen resolution directly in CSS, but also based on whatever context we are going to put our component in. And if you're in a hurry, you can still fake those with resize observers in JavaScript. So it looks a little bit like that. So I took the screenshot with the browser at the same size, but you see the calendar on the left and the little card on the right is basically laying itself out based on whatever space it has. So as a designer, I think we need to stop obsessing over this kind of pixel perfection and embrace this fluid intrinsic nature of the web. So my motto here is designing tool decide in the browser, which means that you need to have a strong designer-developer relationship to do this kind of stuff. And also, usually you need to go as soon as possible in the browser to take this kind of decision. So what we do with my dev team is we do this kind of design developer peer reviews. It's a little bit easier to do that face-to-face, but we've been working remotely from 1 year and it works pretty well. So basically the developer is showing me their screen, we are discussing, he's changing things all the way around, and we are basically fine-tuning some of those things directly in the browser. So I'm designing those components in kind of different version based on whatever we need. And then as soon as they're implemented, then we have a second round of this kind of fine-tuning. We've adapted component to different viewports and different container, but there's a lot of things that can happen with the design. So what about designing for scale beyond this kind of default state and happy path and content? So I talked to you about my content model and about my image, but what happens if there's no image? So you could have a placeholder, or you could just say, if there's no image, the component is able to stretch. And this is not a complicated design decision to take. But again, as a designer, I need to anticipate that, and I need to tell my developer what's going to happen so that they can anticipate too how they're going to build an HTML and CSS flexible enough to be able to accommodate for this kind of, maybe at some point we are not going to have an image, or maybe you will have a placeholder. What happens to your component if there's no content value yet? For instance, if you don't have any votes. Technically, if you have 0 votes, you have 0 stars. The problem with that is quite misleading for your user. If they don't see any stars, they might think, okay, the recipe is not good enough. It doesn't have any stars. So maybe we should not use this component if we don't have any stars. Maybe we should have a no rating available. And then the question is, how many rating do we need until we actually display the stars? Because only one rating with which is either a 5 or 1 might be misleading. Or you can say, we don't display it at all, but then is our user going to think it's a bug or something? So this is the kind of stuff that you might need to user test at some point. And then how does it scale? So it looks nice with like my little tile with 5 components inside it, or only 1. But what happens if I have like 10 or 100 of those? Do I have a pagination? Do I have a scroll? Do I have this kind of eternal loading button, things like that? So again, it's not difficult design decisions to take, but at some point you need to take them and to communicate them with dev team. What happens if the title needs 2 lines? Well, we stretch, okay, but then what happens to the right part of my component? Is it going to stay at the top? Is it going to be a middle line? This happens a lot with tables, by the way. If you're working with data table, you need to decide what's going to happen with the table. Do I keep it at top? Do I keep it in the middle or something? Then how does it behave in a gallery? Usually when you do a mockup, you have this perfectly aligned stuff. But again, what happens when I have more content? Does this component have the height of its content? Do I have a min height and something like that? So again, a lot of design decisions to take and to communicate. So a few tips about scaling content. If you use fake content, I have to use fake content most of the time because of security. Make sure that the structure is close to the real one. So I have like fake numbers and stuff, but it's the exact same number that I would have in real content. Then if your designer ask for the limits to your developers, but also ask for the minimum, maximum, and the average content length. Maybe you can have 100 characters in the database, but if the average is not 100, but 50, maybe the default case might be 50, and then you have to accommodate for 100 at some point. If you're a developer, if something is missing, ask the designer how it should behave. Like, it's really hard sometimes as a designer, you're in a rush, you're so much into your components and everything, and something might just slip through the cracks and you forget about it. So feel free to ask. Most of us are super happy to help. And then for translations, I live in Luxembourg, so we have a lot of languages here. Try to know upfront if there's going to be needed some, and kind of make sure that your components still work with different languages. And don't forget about the states. So a component is not just kind of one single state, especially with like stuff like buttons, form, and things like that. There's a lot of different states that you might need to document at some point. So you don't need to design all of those, but just to decide at some point what will happen and document it with the dev team. So I have a lot of those components where I have like tiles that we are going to populate with data. I don't need to design the empty state, the loading state, and the arrow state of all of those tiles. They will almost all look the same. So I have my component data population state in the design system. And then in the Jira ticket, we have for each of those the different states, and especially the empty state, which is basically there are no to display in the exact message. So also something that helped a lot, I think, making our component better in the last couple of months is having this kind of checklist for the gyro ticket, so that we don't forget about the empty state, all of those things, because yeah, basically we're human beings and the brain is kind of not always perfect. Another thing I do a lot to help developers understand how it's supposed to work at component level and at page level is building user flows. And then once I have the detailed mockups, I turn those into screen flows. So user flow is kind of, again, this kind of abstraction that help developer understand how it's going to work, like the different steps and everything. And the screen flow is basically the user flow, but with the actual screen with a lot of things. Because again, even if you do write a lot of specification, even if you kind of do super detailed Jira ticket, even with a prototype, sometimes it's not always super easy to understand how it's going to flow. How do you go from one page to the other or something like that? So having something visual, I think really, really helps like most of the time. And then show don't tell. So if I'm doing prototypes because I'm doing some usability testing, I usually will also show the prototype to the dev team. So this is actual prototype. It was on a wireframe, but it's the same like for components. For instance, we've been working on a super complex component for search results, and we put the prototype in the ticket as well, so they can have this kind of look and feel on how it's supposed to behave at some point. Then the last thing I want to talk about is how much we adapt components towards user context. And user context can be a lot of different things. For instance, at some point, our user might not have any connection. We might have to deal with connection loss. So our component might need to also adapt to that kind of thing. So for instance, if you're building a messaging app or an email app or one of those Dropbox, a Google Drive-ish app where you're synchronizing files and data, not only do you need a default state, but you might also need what does it look like if we don't have a connection and synchronization failed, and also what is it looking like while it's synchronizing, and what it looks like once the synchronization is successful, and then how long do we keep the last state until it goes back to everything is normal or something like that. So all of those small details that are sometimes really hard to imagine when you are into a design tool, and you might not think about all of those things that might really happen in the user environment about connection and things like that. Then dark versus light mode. So speaking about media query, we have now media query to detect the user preferences regarding dark and light mode. So at some point, I know that we start talking about for our design system about how we might have some dark and light mode as well here. So this is some extra stuff you might need to think about as well. Also, you could imagine adapting to the real user environment. So not only dark mode based on user preference, but based on context. If you think about, where is this? Okay, sorry. If you think about GPS app, for instance, it's able to adapt to user context by using two things. It's going to use light sensor, but also your GPS location to detect that, oh, actually she's in a tunnel. So I should maybe switch to dark mode so that it will be less eye strain or something like that. There's a lot of cool things you can do, and there's some API to do that in the web as well. So I put a demo in the Miro board to one of those API that lets you adapt kind of the little bubble towards lights. But there's interesting use cases, I think, here, which is our smartphone especially have more and more those detection capabilities so that you can actually adapt. Then there's adapting the component to different steps in a process. Like if you think about checkout process, but also once you've checked out, sometimes on Amazon or any other one, you have this delivery process, which is most of the time the same component, but a little bit different. Or this is the design I adapted to my identity because I could not mention the client, but I was basically designing mobile application so that you can bring your car to the dealership outside of opening hours. And there's some steps. So you need to open the gate. So you need to get the gate code, then park the vehicle, sign documents that you're going to leave your car there and get a rental. Then grab the key of the rental, have those damage report, all of that. And you see, it's kind of the same component, but depending on the different steps in the process, you might have to tweak it a little bit. And then there's an idea, how about adapting to user needs and expectation across a journey? What you need from your boarding pass on an iPhone or on a smartwatch might not be the exact same thing if you're 2 days before the trip than if you're like 1 hour before the trip. If you're 2 days before going to the airport, you might be super interested into actually knowing which kind of airport you need to go to. If you're in Berlin, I think there's a lot of those, San Francisco, also there's many cities, big cities have multiple airports, and you want to make sure you go to the right one. That's like date and boarding. But then if you're like 1 hour before the flight, we might assume you're already at the airport. Otherwise, it might be difficult to catch your flight. So maybe we could kind of enhance this a little bit, have some information get a little bit bigger, like the seats, the gates. And it would be the same on the smartwatch, which would be basically something like that, where you would have almost the same component, just adapted a little bit. And then if you swipe, you get the QR code. So adapting to the user journey is something experimental. I would be careful with it. And again, heavily user test, that kind of things. That could be something interesting for some use cases and for some specific journey. And then if you have this kind of adaptive features, no one likes I know better than you interface. So make sure users have the final say, they're in control. So this is the screenshot from Google's forum where people explain that they really don't like one of those automatic adapted feature, which is this GPS changes from drive to work when they are close to a delivery destination. And the people who are giving those feedback are apparently people who are doing a lot of deliveries, and it's having them lose a lot of time on those delivery, which is a little bit annoying because for many delivery, like food delivery services or anything else, you're actually time tracked. So they're basically just asking, okay, a nice feature, but in my case, it doesn't apply. Please let me like remove or have a way to switch off this adaptive feature. So always have the user in control, whatever you do. And again, you need to deeply understand user need and behavior in order to build this kind of experiences. So user research. A last thing you could do to adapt your component is using machine learning and big data. If you look at the results of Google at the moment, for reproduction rates, a lot of the results are linked to COVID situation, epidemiology results. I think a few years ago, you might have had more demographic results, but here Google is kind of understanding the situation and adapting the results. So you could imagine using machine learning and things like that to, again, adapt the content, adapt the components based on some kind of prediction of user need. But then don't forget about everything around privacy, about security, things like that, and also algorithm bias. So as soon as we talk about machine learning and stuff like that, we need to be, again, super careful. So as a summary, usually when you are going to build component, you want to think beyond screen sizes about how might I build components that I can actually reuse, that can lay themselves out based on this kind of own ideal condition. We need to not forget about designing for scale beyond the happy path. What happens if the component doesn't load? What happens if I don't have an image? What happens with every single cases I showed you? Conduct user research and use content models and information architecture to take this kind of design decisions. Also, like, try to explain them to dev team too, so that they really understand why this is here, not here, and things like that. And it's a collaborative process with your development team. So thank you.
Nice.
Thank
Getting
you.
my camera back.
Stéphanie, thank you so much. Awesome talk. Amazing. So many insights. I don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
I have so many questions because then I ask myself, I mean, you are so, is it T-shaped the right word I'm looking for? Like, it seems like you're a user research expert, you're a product designer, feels like you're a front-end developer.
No, I'm not a front-end developer. Don't ask me anything about JavaScript, please. Yeah, I'm passionate about CSS and HTML, so I follow a lot of the specification and everything, but I have no idea how to write JavaScript apart from doing some toggle button and a resize intersect observer to have a plant grow on my website, and even that I had help. So yeah, no JavaScript.
Yeah, but at least you understand code, right? Like the structure and the components. I think, yeah, because it looks like that you're very skilled at this as well, at this front end part. Because we have a question. People were asking if designers code or understand the code or the structure. Should designers learn the code?
Number one question I have usually with the number two is what's your favorite kind of pizza, and then it's what's your take on Hawaii pizza. So yeah, coming back to should designer code, I don't think designers should code to be able to design, but I still think that you need to understand the medium you're designing for. Like if you're a print designer, most of the time you need to understand paper, you need to understand ink. You don't need to understand how the paper is made, but you still need to understand how the paper is going to absorb some inks and things like that. And I think if you're designing for web or mobile or anything digital, or if you're designing for video games, for instance, you need to deeply understand how video games work and things like that. So I think if you're designing for web, you don't need to know how to code, but understanding how the browser is working and kind of having some basic understanding of what's HTML, what's CSS, what's JavaScript. Without, like, as I said, I have no idea how to write most of lines of JavaScript, but I understand kind of the logic behind it, how it's working in the browser, and also limitations and things like that. So I think I have a friend who usually says you need to be proficient enough to have a conversation with developers. But then you need to be proficient enough in a lot of things. Like I was talking about error message and security. This is also kind of, you need to understand how the backend is working. And like for error messages, for instance, at the moment, like today, I had my QA tester who came back to me and said, we have this generic error message, which is quite horrible. And this happened because we have a token that is somewhere being lost between two pages. And when you arrive on a page, you have this kind of gallery of components in the page that all say, oh, we have an error, we can't do anything about that, please contact support, which is horrible. You have this whole page, every one of those has the same error message. And we were talking about that, and I said, yeah, but at some point, we need to get the right error code. So I have no idea how the backend works. It's Java, but I know that at some point, this is going to send an error code. I just want to know what error code it is to maybe write a better message. And here I know that basically there's a token problem, and what user can do, they can refresh the page. And if they refresh the page, the error is gone. So instead of having this horrible page full of, oh, please contact support, like, no, please refresh the page, you have a token problem, or maybe even like you have a token problem is kind of too high level, maybe just like, please refresh the page, something like that. So it's the same for everything. Understand enough, and I think it comes with time. Like if you've been working, long enough with developers, at some point, you catch up like a little bit what's going on.
And I think it's also beneficial for a mindset just on how to think. We can learn a lot from developers. They have a much more practical approach to things, and designers tend to be a little bit more on the creative side, sometimes a bit chaotic. And I think, developers have processes that are definitely valid for us.
Have you seen my content model? My colleague is making fun of me because I'm the one complaining that we don't have documentation for data format and number format. It's like, but you're a designer, you should be creative and chaotic. Why are you? It's true, but why are you the one? Because I need to know what's the data format. So, yeah.
And so how do you user test these components?
In context. So usually we don't user test component by component. We usually user test pages, but at the moment we even test them before they're implemented. So this is why I actually like Axure a lot for prototyping, and you can do the design in Sketch and Figma, then you can import the design into Axure and you have like super high level prototyping. You can even put JavaScript in there if you want, but yeah, most all the components for the search that we are currently designing were tested and fine-tuned without even coding them. So basically testing the prototype before, and then of course at some point when it will go to production, we'll have even more feedback. So at the moment, we don't really use the tests once it's coded, but we do feedback sessions. It's a little bit weird at some point because we're working on an internal tool, and it's actually the first time that they have a user-driven process. So it's always a little bit complicated because at some point people are not quite used to this kind of process. So they were used to have kind of a list of requirements and do something, and then so we have these two phases: prototype testing, fine-tuning the prototype, implementation, then it goes to production. And then we still have our kind of beta tester users who will come back with feedback. And we also do a lot of observing people. So at the moment, we have these sessions where we basically give people access to the beta. We ask them, okay, what you are doing with the old thing, please try to do the exact same thing with the new. And tell me think aloud, basically, if things are missing, if you're surprised. So we are more doing this kind of observing people work on the specific task. But this, again, is related to the fact that I'm working on a kind of internal tool for the whole bank. So if you're in B2C, if I was working in B2C, it might be a little bit different than that.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah, yesterday you texted me that you are working on a design system while listening to design system talks.
No, but yesterday I was basically realigning components. So we had some feedback about how I should have anticipated that, but there's too much white space and there's the interface is not condensed enough. Like welcome to enterprise design, where people would love to have an Excel sheet in the browser. And I love those people. Like the feedback is so enlightening and so amazing. Like basically every single tip you get about UI, like make the font bigger, more white space, you can take all of that and throw it away as soon as you come into this enterprise UX. And so we had basically a realignment, and we decided to switch all the paddings for a lot of the tables. So yeah, I was listening to the talks while changing my paddings on Sketch yesterday. I couldn't do that while doing user research, but this was kind of low brain task and activity, so it was fine.
I think we've all been there, right? You just need to like redo some stuff. Like, oh, come on. Only if there was a bot that could do that for us. So how do you shift designers from focusing on the pixel and focusing on the user experience?
I think I would just try to show them actual users using something, which is usually when you start understanding that things that seem to be super high level, like, oh my God, this icon is not aligned. We can't go to production with this icon not aligned. They don't care as long as you can click on the icon. And things you think it's a given, like being able to copy paste a URL in the browser is something that amazes them, because the old tool was so kind of old school, and you could not have single URL. Everything was loading in the page, so you could even share a page. And whenever like you have this, oh wow, this is amazing. Like, what is amazing? The fact that I can open it in 2 tabs. Like, okay, sure. I wasn't expecting that, but actually, yeah. So I would really try to tell people, like, go try to observe people using your product, and you will see that stuff that matters to designers sometimes are not as important, while other things might become quite important.
Yeah, I can second that. I've been working on some internal software redesigns as well. And I mean, the UX is a mess. I mean, I think everybody could improve something in there because mostly they didn't think about UX at all.
I think they didn't think, but also it's kind of they built upon stuff over the years. So at some point we have to put the button somewhere. But yeah, let's put it wherever there's space, because otherwise we need to rebuild the half of the thing. So I kind of understand how you arrive with this kind of super messy things, which is like piling on top of each other over the years.
Very nice. And I agree completely. That's the best tip, really. If you want to have people changing their focus from pixel to user experience, just put it in front of a user. See what happens. Nice. And how does your user research approach looks like?
So again, currently in this current process, so we are actually super user driven. We have these things that we call it a user cloud, which is basically we decide to go from one user type to another. So we know they have specific needs. So we have a first phase, which is we interview them and try to understand their tasks and activities. So again, this is enterprise product. The product is used to create projects for the whole bank, and a project can be between 2 to 40 years, something like that. We have projects that are super old. So the first thing we do is kind of a first interview where we ask them about tasks and activities, and I can share the links. We have, so my friend Geoffrey and his colleague did this kind of user task canvas where they did a workshop where they ask about tasks, about dependencies. So we are super task driven here because it's basically kind of a productivity tool. So once we have this kind of first interview with the people, we have a lot of user needs most of the time. There's a lot of things that are actually out of the scope because our product is linked to other products, and the user don't really make the difference when our product stops versus the other one starts. So we get a lot of feedback also for other products of the bank that are out of the scope, but still we just write them down. So we have those a lot of feedback. We have a priority matrix where we put all of those feedback. And there we have a different column. There's one for business. It's basically points. So you have like how many points is it for the business? How many points is it for the user? So how important is it for the business? How many users need that have actually this need? And then we have points for how long it's going to take to design it and how long it's going to take to develop it. So kind of costs. And based on that, in the matrix, you have this kind of 4-quadrant matrix at the end, which is you have like stuff that cost a lot of time and money and are almost not asked by anyone, which will be going at the bottom of the backlog. But we still take notes of those to have kind of a history. And then we start with the quick wins, which is something that is easy, doesn't cost a lot, plus is going to make a lot of people happy. So we chase those down. So this is kind of the user research phase. And meanwhile, we are still continuing migrating some content because we don't have enough components to say, for this one, for this table, I don't need a design. This is the data. It's a 3-column table. It works like that. Please migrate this. You put it here and that's done. So once we have this kind of 2 things at the same time, which is basically the kind of super heavy user-driven process, plus this kind of small little things that we know we can migrate. And then once we have talked to the users, we ask them, hey, by the way, do you want to come back for maybe 1 hour session or a little bit longer, where we are actually going to give you access to the interface. So this is the thing I was talking to you about before, which is, please, you talked about tasks and activities 2 weeks ago. No, please try to perform those, but with the new beta interface. So sometimes, this is basically like once we have like the things we have ongoing, and then there's the super heavy special needs where we really need focused user research. And for those, like the new search or the task app I showed you, for those we go even deeper, we have like the first round of user needs, then we do some prototypes, and then we do actual prototype testing with the whole writing test case scenario, asking the questions. So this is like the giving the user access and observing them while doing tasks and activities a little bit, I wouldn't say chaotic, because we have a script, but at some point it will really depend on whatever those people were doing. So it's kind of improvising while still like observing them while doing something. But on the things that are really, really critical, we do like really proper prototyping testing. Then we improve the prototype. And then this goes back again, like writing Jira stories, testing with a Q&A. I have a tester, and then goes to users. We still have some rounds of feedbacks. So yeah,
Wow.
it's kind of a super complex process.
Well, full of steps.
We're
that's
improving.
For sure.
Yeah.
But I think you're including everything that really needs to be there anyway. It's just that, user testing is never a straightforward one direction thing, right? Cool. So we are at the top of the hour right now, and we still have some more questions. So if you have some time and would like to answer them, just go to the Miro board, provide your comments, because I'm sure the people would be curious to know more details on the responsiveness of the components and things like that. And I see that you already shared some of the resources, which is awesome. Thank you so much for linking all the great stuff. And thank you. It was really awesome.
Thanks a lot.
Stéphanie, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with the community. Awesome talk. And thank you so much for believing in this event. I mean, I reached out a year ago, kind of. We had an appointment in October, the other one in February. And now it's almost April. Thank you so much.
And it's amazing.
It's happened. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stéphanie. See you around in Biro. Great talk. Thank you.